Hello, and welcome back to the Classical Training Ground. Last time we discussed Genesis, we saw that God cursed the serpent who seduced Adam and Eve. The serpent's seed will be a constant war with Eve's, but Eve's seed will eventually triumph in the end with the dominion originally promised to Adam back in 1:26. Today, we will see how that conflict between the seeds will arise and how that glimmer of hope will begin to emerge. All right, so this video is really going to take me back to Hebrew 3 in seminary because that lesson was quite memorable and quite impactful on my thinking in not only Genesis 4 here, but the early chapters of Genesis as a whole. So remember back in 3:15 when God had promised that the seed of the woman would crush and defeat the seed of the serpent. Remember also that Adam expresses faith in God's promise when he named his wife Eve as mother of all living. Here in Genesis 4:1, Eve also begins to express that hope when she bears and names her first two sons. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. Now, we need to remember that biblical names are supposed to have significance. Cain's name is related to the Hebrew verb kana, which means to acquire. Eve believes that God has given Cain to her to defeat the serpent and subdue the world. Now, how does Eve name her second son? Verse 2 tells us, and again she bore his brother Abel. Now, his name Abel is based on the word hevel, which means vapor or breath. So, next to Cain, who is supposed to be the promised seed, Abel is kind of an afterthought. As the story continues, we see that Cain grows agriculture and Abel becomes a shepherd. Verses 3 and 4 narrate that both present offerings to God. Abel, however, gives the more pleasing offering to God than Cain does. Why? Well, Abel, the shepherd and the afterthought, gives the firstborn of his flocks to God. Cain, by contrast, does not give the firstfruit of his crops. Instead, he himself gives God, well, an afterthought. So, could Abel potentially be the promised seed of the woman who will defeat the serpent? As the prospective chosen one, Cain is obviously quite angry. In verse 6, God gives Cain the chance to improve, but is that what Cain does? Well, as it turns out, Cain rises up and murders Abel. That is the first murder we see in the Bible. Remember back in chapter 3 when God questioned Adam and Eve about their sin. Now, Adam and Eve did pass blame, but they did also admit to their wrong. Cain doesn't do that here. Instead, he asks quite sarcastically of God, I don't know, am I my brother's keeper? Now, remember here that Abel had been a shepherd, a keeper of sheep. So Cain is playing on that by asking, should he be the shepherd of his younger shepherd brother? Now, God asks of Cain what he had asked of Eve back in 3:13. What is this you have done? Or in Hebrew, mazota sita. Except here, while Eve did admit to her wrong, God has to be the one to name the charge for Cain. Now pay attention to what happens here in verse 11. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Remember here that God had said, Cursed are you, not to Adam and Eve, but to the serpent. Here we see that, while Cain had been the prospective seed of the woman as Eve's firstborn, he turns out to be the seed of the serpent. As a result, God tells Cain in verse 12 that he must be a sojourner and a nomad. Now, he doesn't mean that literally because Cain goes and builds a city. Instead, what it means is that Cain is cut off from the community of God's people, having aligned himself with God's enemy. Cain even names that city after his son, Enoch. This should remind us of the serpent's temptation back in Genesis 3:5. You will be like God, knowing good and evil. That temptation was to autonomy and self deification. Cain fully indulges in that temptation by building a name for himself. He has shown repeatedly through his actions that, despite his physical humanity, he is the seed of the serpent. Two key points here illustrate that physical seed is not the ultimate standard of what makes a seed in the biblical narrative. First, while Cain is the firstborn of the woman, he turns out to be a child of the serpent. Second, physical descent does not automatically make you offspring of your parents. Again, while Cain is physically descended from humanity, he is a child of the serpent, and as such, he will be defeated. Instead of using that image bearing of God's status to subdue the world, he himself will be subdued with the serpent. While Cain will be defeated, that time is not yet. Watch the grace that God still shows him in verses 13 through 15. All right, so watch Cain's plea here as he's being exiled from God's people. He says in verses 13 and 14, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." So that's Cain's plea. How will I be protected? And God answers him in verse 15, "Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. So here, God provides for Cain. Since his defeat with the serpent is not yet, he and his own seed will be protected before that time. All right, so I see I'm wearing a different shirt now. I often don't do more than one day to do one video, but here I am. Anyway, as we go through the rest of Genesis 4, we see how the two seeds, the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, begin to grow. Uh, Looking at Cain's seed, we see a lot of advancements in culture, such as music, tent making, and metalwork. A lot of these are good things, but watch where Cain's line leads, especially with Lamech in verses 19 and then 23 and 24. Verse 19, "And Lamech took two wives. The name of the one was Adah, and the name of the other, Zillah." Now, see how many wives Lamech has here? Two. Go back to Genesis 2, where you'll see that when a man joins to his wife, the two shall become one flesh. Not the three, not the four, not the seven. Two shall become one flesh. Here, Lamech is already violating this parameter. While we do see others in Genesis engaged in polygamy, we see here from the beginning that it's not supposed to be a good thing. Now, go down to verse 23. "Adah and Zillah," this is what Lamech says to his wives. "Adah and Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold." Here, Lamech puts himself above Cain by lowering the severity of how he was wronged and heightening his own right of retribution. Remember, Cain had to be killed for the vengeance to come on the criminal sevenfold. Here, Lamech is only wounded, and he sets his vengeance not at sevenfold, but at 77-fold. Beyond that, God doesn't give Lamech this right. Lamech declares it for himself. He is asserting that autonomy that the serpent had tempted Adam and Eve with before by asserting for himself authority beyond what God had provided both in marriage and in retribution. All right, so we've seen a little bit about Cain's line as the seed of the serpent, but what about the seed of the woman? So here we go back to Abel, who was murdered by Cain. And in verses 25 and 26, it narrates, "And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord." That last phrase is key. Call upon the name of the Lord. So Cain's line makes its own name great. Seth's line calls on the name of the Lord. And that's the big marker between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. The seed of the serpent calls on its own name in order to make itself God. The seed of the woman, as preserved in Seth's line, calls on the name of the Lord and makes the Lord's name great. It's about submitting to God as opposed to submitting to your own authority and your own rule. And this line will continue in Genesis 5 as we see the genealogy of Adam's line through Seth. So we've seen the seed of the serpent as preserved in Cain's line and the seed of the woman as preserved in Seth's line. So back in Genesis 3:15 and 16, we see the promise that the seed of the woman will defeat the seed of the serpent and subdue the world to God's rule. We already see that in the fact that Seth's line calls on the name of the Lord instead of its own name, but we also know that Seth's line will be the one to conquer and outlive Cain's line. We'll get into that next time here on the Classical Training Ground. Please like and subscribe. If you'd like to become a student with the Classical Training Ground, click the link below in the description and enter the details.